Hi, my name is Crystal Corgatelli. Today we are going to look at the systematic review of the effects of vitamin B12 on 3 outcomes in patients 65 years and older with Alzheimer's disease. As this is a study that focuses on people 65 years and older, the information given and recommendations made are for this specific group. Okay, we are first going to introduce vitamin B12 and its relationship to Alzheimer's disease. After that, we will look at the PICO-T question as well as the parameters. Next, we will explore the research findings and take an in-depth look at the 9 included articles. Following that, we will look at the research findings relevant to the PICO question. And finally, we will discuss the results and the implications of these findings. And if you'll notice my picture here, I really liked it. It's kind of representing Alzheimer's disease, things kind of starting to fade away. So let's see if we can't help those people. We're going to introduce vitamin B12 now. This is a good example of some vitamin B12 or sources of vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is a water-soluble vitamin that helps synthesize methionine, which in turn helps create the components of myelin sheaths of nerve cells and synthesizes neurotransmitters. The essential roles of vitamin B12 are folate metabolism and the role of an intermediate in the citric acid cycle. Its structure is very unusual. It's a complex chemical structure and is the largest of all vitamins. It is also unique because it contains a metal cobalt ion. This is where the names such as methylcobalamin come from. The best food sources are of animal origin and include lambs and mussels. You can see some in the corner there. However, there are some fermented beans and mushrooms that have bioactive forms of the vitamin. Recommendations for adults over 50 years old are that they should meet most of the RDA from fortified food or supplements. This is due to the increased risk of food-bound vitamin B12 malabsorption in the older population. Adults 51 years and older should consume 2.4 milligrams per day. Cyanobalamin and methylcobalamin are 2 primary sources in supplements. Toxicity and upper limits have not been established, and this is because doses as high as 2,000 micrograms per day orally have not exhibited toxicity because of low percent absorption. We're going to introduce In regard to vitamin B12, the largest problem facing older adults is deficiency. Deficiency can lead to cardiovascular disease, breast cancer, osteoporosis, cognitive orally have not exhibited toxicity because of low percent absorption. In regard to vitamin B12, the largest problem facing older adults is deficiency. Deficiency can lead to cardiovascular disease, breast cancer, osteoporosis, cognitive decline, and Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is characterized by the formation of amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. They can cause nerve cell degeneration in the brain and are the most common causes of dementia in older adults. The rate of progression varies, and symptoms include memory loss and confusion, which can worsen over time. There is no cure for Alzheimer's. However, research is being done on vitamin B12 and other nutrients to determine their role in AD and their effectiveness for treatment and prevention of AD. These studies have shown that vitamin B12 deficiency in aging populations have been associated with high levels of homocysteine and methylmalonic acid, both of which are associated with dementia. Some studies also look at biomarkers, and intervention-based studies have indicated that high doses of vitamin have improved homocysteine levels without cognitive impairment. And however, some studies show no relationship with vitamin A and D. So this brings us to the PICO-T question. Okay, so we are talking about the PICO-T question. You can see over here in the photo that methionine, homocysteine, and B12 and folate all kind of play a role in this little system. But the purpose of the PICO-T question was to help provide clarity. The current research has mixed results in regards to the effects of vitamin B12 in Alzheimer's disease, the cognitive function, and methylmalonic acids. So the question is, how does vitamin B12 affect cognitive function, homocysteine, and methylmalonic acids levels in elderly people aged 65 and older who have Alzheimer's disease? Okay, so we are talking about the PICO-T. Okay, so we are talking. Okay, to answer the PICO question, you're looking at the methodology inclusion-exclusion table. So as you note, the year range inclusion was a 5-year inclusion range, and anything before 2013 was not accepted in our inclusion studies. We did a preliminary database search, which was conducted solely in PubMed, and once the primary study was found, the UNI Library of Services Nutrition tab was used to identify the scientific databases. These databases were PubMed, ProQuest Central, Scopus, ScienceDirect, and Biomed Central. The terms that were used in the later search included mesh terms and non-mesh terms, and they are listed in the key terms table. And these studies helped answer the PICO question. And you can see this, and we'll show you the Prisma flow diagram on the next slide to kind of give you a solid idea of what we actually did, how many studies were included. Okay, to answer the PICO question. So here's our Prisma flow diagram, like we just mentioned on the last slide. You can see the identification, screening, eligibility, and inclusion over here, and it tells us that there is 67 records that were identified, and no additional sources were used. All the articles that were included met the inclusion criteria, and none of the exclusion criteria were met when they were critically appraised. The first article critically appraised was the primary article, and this Prisma flow diagram, like I said, it also shows you that 47 duplicates were removed, or 47 articles existed after duplicates were removed, and 39 were excluded for various reasons, such as vitamin B12 in animal studies and genetic studies. So that leaves us with 9 articles, and 9 articles that were included in the review. So here's our Prisma flow. Okay, so this is the primary inclusion article. It was it's a study that was divided into a case group of 112 MCI patients that were diagnosed using modified Peterson's criteria, a case group of 89 patients that were diagnosed using a couple of NIN, CEDS, ADRDA, and 115 controls. The mean serum folate and vitamin B12 levels were significantly lower, and plasma homocysteine levels were significantly higher in patients with MCI and AD than in the controls. And you can see over here it was issued in 2017, and it's a case-controlled study, which is good, from China. We grade this as positive, and you'll see on the next slide where that comes from. Okay, so this is So to continue on with our primary article, you can see that no association was made between low levels of vitamin B and AD or MCI. High homocysteine was significantly associated with MCI. In older Chinese adults, it was found that lower blood levels of folate and vitamin B12 and higher blood levels of homocysteine were associated with MCI and AD. Now, plasma vitamin B12 was analyzed by radioimmunoassay, and plasma homocysteine was analyzed by high-performance liquid chromatography fluorescent methods. The implication for practice that vitamin B12 is able to slow or reduce the cognitive decline in AD patients through lowering homocysteine levels, then it opens the door for cost-effective solutions. Now, this one really does need some more longitudinal studies and to test the long-term results, and it was a non-randomized study, which could cause sampling bias. That's where this one kind of falls a little short, but all in all, it does a wonderful job setting this up. So to continue on with our primary article. Okay, so this is Article 2. It focuses on homocysteine concentrations in the cognitive progression of Alzheimer's disease, also in 2017. The authors, as you can see, are listed here, and it's a longitudinal cohort study that was evaluated, and the relationship between vitamin B12, folate, and hypohomocysteine in 38 Alzheimer's disease patients, and they looked at the patients for 13 months. The participants were tested at baseline and at 389.4 days later. Vitamin B12 through dietary intake did not significantly correlate with plasma concentrations at baseline or follow-up. And really, they're looking at a positive quality grade because they did address quite a few of the biases. So you'll see that on the next slide. Okay, so this is our Article 2. It focuses on homocysteine concentration. Okay, continuing with slide 2. Homocysteine baseline plasma significantly correlated with folate and vitamin B12. Plasma levels increased over time. So this study suggests that in older patients, there's a correlation between AD patients and blood levels of folate and vitamin B12. However, other factors should still be considered. Implications for practice include the use of folate and vitamin B12 in the reduction of AD symptoms. Limitations include a type 2 error due to a small sampling size, and the results are only estimates, so there was no control group, and the choice of vitamin B12 measurement may have affected the accuracy. As I said, they just kind of used plasma levels instead of using something a little more effective like we were talking about on the last slide. Okay, continuing with Okay, so Article 3 is the efficacy of vitamin B supplementation on cognition in elderly patients with cognitive-related disease, also in 2017. And the authors you can see over here, this was a meta-analysis that evaluated the effectiveness of folic acid and vitamin B12 and or vitamin B6 in lowering homocysteine levels in elderly Alzheimer's disease patients. The databases were included in their search were Medline and 3 other databases, and 4 randomized control trials were included. The intervention group ranged from 23 to 240 participants, which meet our inclusion criteria, and 18 to 169 in the placebo group, which also meets our inclusion criteria. 10 people or better. The supplement versus placebo baseline characteristics were comparable in all 4 RTCs, which is what made this a very interesting study and kind of why I picked it. Okay, so on to the results. Okay, so the outcome measured were vitamin B12 serum post-treatment, which increased from 3.79 to 1090.3. The placebo group had no change. The homocysteine serum baseline supplement went from 9.2 to 19.4, and the placebo went from 9.1 to 17.2. Post-treatment supplement was 6.8 to 9.3. The placebo went from 8.6 to 5.2 or 15.2. Cognitive function, which was scored by MMSE scores, were a baseline intervention. Apologize for my phone having too much fun. Shut it down. The control group, and you can see the ADAS COG multivitamin group. There was a 0.9 change after 26 weeks of treatment. All these are relevant, and the study concluded that vitamin B supplementation is effective in reducing homocysteine levels. The implications include the use of vitamin B12 and the reduction of homocysteine, and limitations include the low number of studies included and the various dosage across the studies, and the time varied from 2 weeks to 12 years, which is quite the length of difference. But it's still a decent study, and it does shed light on our PICO question. Okay, so this is our fourth study. Hypohomocysteemia is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease in an Algerian population. This was from 2014. The authors, as you can see, are over here. The case control study evaluated the association of serum total homocysteine and other biochemical risk factors in 41 AD patients and 46 controls. So the numbers are really good on this one. The blood work analyzed were vitamin B12 serum electrochemiluminescent detection using an autoanalyzer. The total homocysteine used fluorescent polarization immunoassay, which is pretty darn good stuff. We're looking at these risk factors pretty seriously in this study. So on to the result. Okay, so vitamin B12 saw a significant decrease in vitamin B12 in the intervention controls versus the total homocysteine. There was a significant increase of total homocysteine in intervention versus controls, and it appears as an independent risk factor predictor of AD. A negative correlation was found between homocysteine and vitamin B12, and there was a significant positive correlation between total homocysteine and a couple other things like creatinine and urea. This study concluded that vitamin B12 deficiency is associated with hyperhomocysteemia and is a risk factor for AD. The practical implications are that vitamin AD can be used to resolve hypohomocysteemia, and the limitations of the study are some of the values in the study observed disagree with other comparable studies. So that could be a potential problem, but they acknowledged it, so we include the study. This is study 5. Serum homocysteine levels are correlated with behavioral and psychological symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So that's what we're looking at. It's in 2014. The authors are over here, as you can see. This is a single-blind study, which is better. They evaluated the relationship of vitamin B12 and the levels of homocysteine in patients with AD. The single-blind study evaluated the intervention group of 40 older adults whose age was greater than 65 years old and scored lower than a 23 on MMSE-KC, and a control group of 37 older adults who was aged, again, greater than 65 years old and had the same score of less than 20, or in other words, no cognitive impairment. Blood samples were taken after a 12-hour fast, and the values were measured were homocysteine, folate, and vitamin B12. And everybody's been really interested in folate. So that's one of those, you'll see that inclusion later. The reference range was 21 to 26 in mild dementia, 11 to 20 was moderate dementia. So the results of that study say that the mean serum showed no significant difference. Homocysteine mean serum showed no significant difference. The intervention group had lower MMSE scores and higher DDS and CDR scores than the control. The study concluded there was no significant relationship between homocysteine and vitamin D or B12, which is interesting because this kind of contradicts everything else that we've seen up till this point. This practice, though, is what they're saying is that these results are suggesting that other values should be used as indicators than the ones they used in this study. The limitations of the study were that it was a retrospective study, and that means that cognitive function assessment and the blood test occurred on different days. So it had a small sample size. That's the other limitation. So good study, interesting thought, but not necessarily one that's going to add a whole lot to the depth of the study. So this is study number 6, potential links between impaired 1-carbon metabolism due to polymorphisms and inadequate vitamin B status and the development of Alzheimer's disease. This was a study done in 2016. As you can see, the authors again. Let's see here. This study evaluated the inadequate intake of vitamin B12 and compared it to people with AD and the potential for vitamin B12 to be an intervention for AD. It looked at the link between several subjects, such as increased levels of homocysteine, insufficient DNA repair, and reduced ability of myelin relationship to patients with AD compared to vitamin B12's ability to slow down or regress the progression of AD. Okay, so let's see what they did. They looked at a bunch of observational trials, and 4 of those were randomized placebo-controlled trials. And so let's go take a look at the results. Okay, so the results are they looked at, they had a cohort study that said that there's plasma homocysteine levels, which doubles the risk of developing AD if you have a level of less than 14 millimole per liter. One meta-analysis said that the homocysteine levels were higher in AD patients compared to controls. There's a McCadden and Miller that said they established the causality between elevated homocysteine and dementia. One meta-analysis said that the risk of developing AD due to high levels of homocysteine and low folate levels was 1.8 and recommended the supplementation of B vitamins. Additionally, they did there's one randomized placebo-controlled trial that did supplementation trials of multiple different types of supplementation, typically with multiple things or multiple doses of B vitamins. And they said they improved memory and reduced the rate of atrophy of AD patients. So there's some limitations to this study. It's just a kind of a review. And so you need to take that into account. And they're kind of all over the place with some of the information. So we're going to have to, take that into account as well. Okay, our study 7 is looking at the neuron enhancement with vitamin B12. You can see the authors over here. This was a review as well. They are trying to increase clinical awareness and association of vitamin B12 and homocysteine and early diagnosis with patients in AD. They looked at 2 coenzymes which are forms of vitamin B12 and diagnostics of dangers of vitamin B12 and cognitive improvement in patients with AD. So some of their testing parameters, they looked at serum vitamin B level, which is low cost, and that's why they went with it. The functional vitamin B12 deficiency levels under 450 nanograms per liter the holotranscobalamin in comparison. They looked, which is a complex of transcobalamin and vitamin B12. They say that deficiency, they found that deficiency is one of the earliest markers for, or this was one of the earliest markers for vitamin B12 deficiency. And even better markers, methylmalonic acid, or MMA, which is a metabolic product that requires vitamin B12. Increase has an inverse relationship with vitamin B12, and it's very sensitive for early diagnosis. Homocysteine also has an inverse relationship, but it may not be as simple as MMA. Additionally, when you run homocysteine and MMA together, vitamin B12 can be ruled out, like a vitamin B12 deficiency as far as AD. It can be ruled out with almost 100% certainty, is what this study has ultimately concluded and kind of found. So the conclusion of the study is a high level of vitamin B12 and the other B vitamins are associated with lower homocysteine and a reduced rate of brain atrophy and cognitive decline in elderly patients with AD. And that would be the study. The limitations are that this could be really huge. So if they found out that you could look at these two, the homocysteine and MMA together to rule out vitamin D deficiency, as far as when it comes to Alzheimer's versus what could be other causes, that would be really huge and direct future research into the right areas. So Article 8 is looking at modifiable factors with cognition and dementia, and we're going to look at the effects and the number of outcomes, including behavioral factors and homocysteine levels, with the goal to delay cognitive decline. And you can see the authors over here. This is a systematic review and a meta-analysis from the United States. See here. This systematic review and meta-analysis looked at the databases such as Medline and included 247 published studies, which is a fair amount, of which 167 were cohort and 80 were cross-sectional studies. The sample sizes had to be over 30, which is great. This study was impressive because they had a really well-defined inclusion criteria. The outcomes had to include AD, cognitive decline, or cognitive impairment. Baseline had to be a healthy sample or population, just like in our inclusion criteria. Nutritional factors, homocysteine looked at high levels of homocysteine with the increased risk of incident AD. Blood levels are mostly determined by vitamin B and B12 and vitamin B6 intakes. So the results and implication of this are plasma homocysteine status can be modified by dietary interventions, and it's inversely related to vitamin B12, as we've seen before. Vitamin B12 can protect against cognitive decline in 3 of the studies, works well with folate to increase the effect on homocysteine. Folate, not necessarily our parameter, but we'll look at it, protects against cognitive decline in 5 of the studies they found. B6, again, 2 studies. There's 12 core studies that say it's related to homocysteine is related to cognitive outcomes. 11 cross-sectional studies say the hypothesis fit for the entire population of 78%, which is really good. This is a very well-defined, well-designed study that comes out and gives some really interesting conclusions as far as homocysteine and vitamin B12. Okay, last but not least, this one's going to look at the circulating biomarkers that predict incident dementia, especially in Alzheimer's disease, again, 2014, and your authors are off to the left here. This is another state, comes from the United States as well, and there is some funding on it, some interesting agencies. The quality rate, again, is a positive. And the purpose of the study was to define identify the best biomarkers for early detection, again, for people at risk for AD, and they wanted to reduce the damage caused by dementia. This review is going to focus on multiple biomarkers, and some of those biomarkers included those with a risk of circulating AD and circulating markers. Okay, so the conclusion of those are that circulating vitamin B12 is an active form of vitamin B12. It's bound to transcopolamine, which is bound to haptocorrin. Homocysteine, which is typically seen as a total plasma homocysteine, is associated with a high risk for AD. Low vitamin B is a marker for high homocysteine. Methylammonic acid is associated with a high risk for AD and vitamin B12 status. There's a Framingham heart study that looked at 192 dementia-free patients, and they had elevated plasma homocysteine for over 8 years before developing AD. So this study concluded that the circulating biomarkers such as vitamin B12 and homocysteine are an effective early indicator as to looking at the development of AD. Study. Okay, as you can see here, there is a visual abstract. We're looking at homocysteine, methylammonic acid, and cognitive function and additional conclusions together. The primary study provided the framework, and it was the first to confirm the inverse relationship of vitamin B12. It has established that there was no association made between vitamin B12 and AD directly. Some studies found that the earliest marker for vitamin B12 is methylammonic acid, which is MMA. Cognitive scores were also needed to answer the question, and the most typical cognitive exam was the MMSE, or mini mental state examination. Not all studies concluded that vitamin B12 and homocysteine had an inverse association, and some concluded that the supplement of vitamin B12 and B6 and folate, as you can see here, reduces the effects and the progression of AD. By defining these relationships between vitamin B12 and cognitive function, homocysteine, and methylammonic acid, and determining the most effective blood tests, cognitive tests, and other biomarkers while using the most current methods, that these articles answered the question, the PICO question. Okay, so just as a reminder, the PICO-T question was, how does vitamin B12 affect cognitive function, homocysteine, and methylammonic acids in elderly people ages 65 and older who have Alzheimer's disease? So the concluding statement for this systematic review is that vitamin B12 has an inconsistent relationship with the effectiveness of reducing decline of cognitive function in patients 65 years and older. It was shown to have an inverse relationship with homocysteine. However, there's very little information regarding it, vitamin B12 and MMA, except that MMA has been indicated in a couple of studies that is possibly a better indicator of the risk of AD in people who are 65 years and older. The conclusion statement grade is a grade 2, which is fair. There's some of the studies that could have been better and some of the studies that were pretty good. So that's where we come up with that. Okay, so the strengths and limitations. I like mellow chains here. They're kind of fun. They got nice solid chains versus the chains held with this little tiny piece of grass or string or whatever it is. There are several strengths and limitations to this study. The strengths are, in particular, there were 67 articles reviewed out of 5 databases and include 9 studies. All the articles, for the most part, with the exception of probably 1 or 2, they were well defined with limited bias. All included articles answered part, if not all, the PICO question, which is a huge benefit. The limitations, there was one study that had quite a bit more bias. And when I mean bias, that they didn't acknowledge, they were funded by a vitamin company. So that was a little bit on the disappointing side, but they did provide some decent research. Only 9 studies were included, and further research is really going to help define the PICO-T questions that, the parts that weren't answered. Very few questions answer the PICO-T question completely, and I found this pretty common when it comes to they study one specific subject. So the implications for research and practice are we've determined gaps in the literature that opens the door for additional and more focused research. We've added the current knowledge by summarizing the 9 included studies against the question, found and reported 67 studies that were not, we found 67 studies that had non-applicable to the PICO question, which will provide future research with a better focus. For nutrition practice, we're going to look at newer, more potentially effective ways at identifying at-risk AD patients through methylmalonic acid, which would be very interesting, and it could provide a new, more cost-effective way supplementing vitamin B12 versus more expensive AD medications in reducing the risk of cognitive decline and associated AD. This is the references on the next slide, and so here we go. Okay, and here are the references. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you later. Have a great day.